There is a number flashing in red in the heart of New York City. It sits above Times Square, ticking upward every second. 35 trillion, 36, 37, on its way to $38 trillion. It's so large that the human brain refuses to process it. Stack $38 trillion in $1 bills, and the pile wouldn't just reach the moon, it would stretch beyond it. The number feels fictional, abstract, like a scoreboard in a video game. For years, that's how we treated it. Politicians shrugged. Economists reassured us. Deficits don't matter. We owe it to ourselves. As long as GDP grows, we're fine. But something changed. In 2024, the debt stopped being theoretical. For the first time in American history, the United States government is spending more on interest payments than on national defense. Let that sink in. Not more on health care, not more on infrastructure, not more on education, more on interest. The bill to service the debt is approaching $1 trillion per year. That's money that produces nothing. It doesn't build roads. It doesn't invent technology. It doesn't train soldiers. It simply pays bondholders for money already borrowed. And here's the terrifying part. The government doesn't have that money. To pay the interest on old debt, it issues new debt. Imagine paying your credit card minimum by opening another credit card. That works for a while, but every month the balance grows, and eventually the interest itself becomes the monster. This is called a debt spiral. Unlike a household, the U.S. government cannot simply cut back. The largest portions of federal spending, Social Security and Medicare, are mandatory. These are promises made decades ago to an aging population. Breaking them is political suicide. Raising taxes enough to solve the problem? That would require something close to doubling income taxes or slashing spending so aggressively it would trigger a depression. And defaulting? Unthinkable. The entire global financial system is built on one core assumption. U.S. Treasury bonds are risk-free. Banks hold them. Pension funds depend on them. Foreign governments use them as reserves. If the United States explicitly refused to pay, the shockwave wouldn't just hit Wall Street, it would paralyze global trade overnight. So if cutting is impossible and default is catastrophic, what's left? There is a third option, an option that doesn't look like default, an option that doesn't require Congress to vote, an option that feels almost invisible. You pay every dollar back, but you change what the dollar is worth. This is called a soft default. Instead of refusing to pay, you inflate. Here's the math. If the government owes $30 trillion and inflation runs at 5%, the real purchasing power of that debt shrinks by 5% in 1 year. 5% of $30 trillion is $1.5 trillion. That means, in real terms, $1.5 trillion of debt disappears without raising taxes, without cutting spending, without announcing anything. Bondholders still receive their money, but that money buys less.
Your grocery bill rises. Your rent rises. Your insurance rises. And quietly, the debt burden shrinks. This isn't conspiracy, it's arithmetic. After World War II, in 1945, U.S. debt reached 119% of GDP. The government didn't default. It didn't impose crushing austerity. Instead, for nearly a decade, interest rates were capped around 2.5%, while inflation averaged over 6%. Every year, savers lost purchasing power. Every year, the debt became lighter. History shows something uncomfortable. When governments are over-debt, they rarely default outright. They rarely slash spending dramatically. They inflate. And today, with debt racing toward $38 trillion, we are watching the same playbook unfold, just updated for a digital age. But here's where the story becomes unsettling. Because inflation alone isn't enough. If investors demanded high interest rates to compensate for inflation, say 10% like they did in the early 1980s, the interest on $38 trillion would be $3.8 trillion per year. That would exceed total federal tax revenue. The government would collapse under its own interest bill. So interest rates cannot be allowed to rise too high, and that means something else must change. We are entering a new era, one where the central bank's independence begins to blur, where markets are no longer entirely free, and where the rules quietly adjust to protect the Treasury at all costs. This isn't a sudden crash, it's a slow boil, and most people don't even feel the water getting warmer. Because inflation is just the surface. Underneath it is a system designed to make sure someone always buys the debt, even if they don't want to. And once you see how that works, you'll never look at your savings the same way again. In a free market, lenders set the terms. If you borrow too much, your interest rate rises. If you look risky, investors demand compensation. If your balance sheet spirals out of control, capital walks away. That's how markets are supposed to work. But what happens when the borrower isn't a company or a household? What happens when the borrower is the United States government? At nearly $38 trillion in debt, the U.S. cannot afford market rates if those rates reflect true inflation risk. If investors demanded 10%, like they did in the early 1980s, annual interest costs would explode to roughly $3.8 trillion per year. That is more than the government collects in income taxes. So rates cannot rise freely, which means demand for U.S. Treasury bonds cannot be left entirely to the market. And this is where the system quietly shifts. Tool number 1, the captive buyer. In theory, lenders set the terms. If you borrow too much, your interest rate rises. If you look risky, investors demand compensation. If your balance sheet spirals out of control, capital walks away. That's how markets are supposed to work. But what happens when the borrower isn't a company or a household? What happens when the borrower is the United States government? At nearly $38 trillion in debt, the U.S. cannot afford market rates if those rates reflect true inflation risk. If investors demanded 10%, like they did in the early 1980s, annual interest costs would explode to roughly $3.8 trillion per year. That is more than the government collects in income taxes. So rates cannot rise freely, which means demand for U.S. Treasury bonds cannot be left entirely to the market.
It doesn't matter if yields are below inflation. It doesn't matter if real returns are negative. To satisfy liquidity ratios and regulatory standards, institutions are structurally pushed into government debt. This creates artificial demand. It ensures there is always a buyer, not because the bonds are attractive, but because they are mandatory. Your pension fund may not be buying treasuries because they love the return. They may be buying them because the regulatory framework leaves little alternative. This is called financial repression, and it's not new. After World War II, the Federal Reserve capped long-term treasury yields at 2.5%, even while inflation averaged over 6%. The result was predictable. Savers lost purchasing power year after year. The debt-to-GDP ratio fell, not because the debt was paid down, but because the value of the money eroded. Now, fast forward to today. Inflation spikes, rates rise briefly, markets wobble, and suddenly the pressure becomes clear. The higher rates go, the more the Treasury bleeds, which leads to tool number 2, the broken compass. Inflation is not just an economic force, it's also a measurement. The official inflation rate, the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, determines adjustments for Social Security, government benefits, and Treasury inflation-protected securities. If CPI reads 10%, the government must pay more. If CPI reads 4%, the obligation shrinks. So how inflation is measured matters enormously. Over the decades, the methodology has evolved. Substitution adjustments assume that if steak becomes expensive, consumers switch to hamburger, so the cost of living hasn't risen as much as the price of steak. Hedonic adjustments assume that if a car costs more but has better features, part of the price increase reflects quality improvement, not inflation. These adjustments may have technical justification, but they also reduce reported inflation. And when inflation is reported lower than what households feel, lower than rent increases, lower than grocery bills, the government's indexed payments rise more slowly. Small differences compound. A 2% understatement of inflation over a decade significantly reduces the real value of obligations. In other words, measurement itself becomes a policy tool. But even that isn't enough, because what happens when foreign buyers step back? For decades, countries like China and Japan accumulated massive amounts of U.S. Treasury debt. But as geopolitical tensions rise and deficits expand, foreign demand has become less reliable. And when private buyers hesitate, there is one entity that can always step in: the Federal Reserve. Tool number 3, the buyer of last resort. Through quantitative easing, the Federal Reserve creates digital dollars and uses them to purchase government bonds. This pushes bond prices up. Yields go down. The government's borrowing cost stays manageable, but the money supply expands. More dollars chase the same goods. Asset prices rise. Stocks climb. Real estate surges. Your 401k looks healthier. Your house appears more valuable. But underneath the surface, purchasing power shifts. This is how debt is softened, not erased overnight, not forgiven, but diluted. Yet here's the twist that makes this story uncomfortable. Inflation does not affect everyone equally. The system doesn't just shrink debt, it redistributes wealth. And in the next part, we confront the most controversial question of all: who benefits first and who pays last? Because the debt isn't just being erased, it's being transferred. And if you don't understand how that transfer works, you may already be funding it. When new money enters the system, it doesn't fall from the sky. It enters somewhere specific, and where it enters determines who wins. An 18th century economist, Richard Cantillon, observed something powerful. The first receivers of new money benefit the most. By the time that money spreads through the economy, prices have already adjusted. Today, we call this the Cantillon Effect. When the Federal Reserve expands the money supply, whether through quantitative easing or emergency lending, the first stop is not Main Street, it's the financial sector. Large banks, asset managers, institutional investors, they receive liquidity first. They deploy it into assets, stocks, real estate, private equity, technology. Asset prices rise, portfolios swell, balance sheets strengthen, but wages don't adjust instantly. By the time inflation reaches grocery stores, rental markets, insurance premiums, the people living paycheck to paycheck feel it last. The wealthy get the money before inflation. The middle class gets inflation before the money. And that gap compounds. Since 2008, asset prices have dramatically outpaced wage growth. The top 10%, those who own most financial assets, have seen their wealth accelerate. The bottom 90%, reliant primarily on wages, face rising costs without matching gains in purchasing power. This is not an accident. It is a structural side effect of how debt is inflated away. Because inflation reduces the real value of debt, but it also reduces the real value of savings. If you keep your money in a savings account earning 4%, while real inflation runs closer to 7 or 8%, you are losing purchasing power every year. Slowly, quietly, mathematically. At 5% inflation, purchasing power is cut in half in roughly 14 years. That's not dramatic, it's not explosive, it's gradual. And that's why it works. The government doesn't need hyperinflation. It needs controlled erosion. 4 to 5% inflation sustained over a decade shrinks the real burden of debt dramatically without triggering panic. But this creates a new problem. For 40 years, the standard financial advice was simple. Work hard, save consistently, invest in a balanced 60-40 portfolio, 60% stocks, 40% bonds, and retire comfortably. That model was built in an era where bonds provided real yield, where interest income preserved purchasing power, where money itself was relatively stable. In a world of fiscal dominance, where the debt load influences monetary policy, that model becomes fragile. If bonds yield less than inflation, the safe portion of your portfolio guarantees loss in real terms. If cash yields below inflation, saving becomes punishment. The system quietly shifts from rewarding prudence to rewarding risk. To preserve purchasing power, households are pushed into assets, stocks, real estate, speculative investments, even crypto. Not necessarily to get rich, but simply to avoid getting poorer. The entire economy begins to resemble a casino where sitting out is the losing move. And this is where the tension rises. Because the higher asset prices climb, the more dependent the system becomes on continued monetary support. If markets fall sharply, the pressure on policymakers intensifies. Interest rates must stay manageable. Liquidity must be available. The Treasury must remain solvent. The Federal Reserve, historically independent, begins to face a constraint. If it raises rates too high to crush inflation, interest costs on $38 trillion surge. If it keeps rates too low, inflation persists. This is the trap. Economists call it fiscal dominance, when fiscal realities begin to dictate monetary policy. In the early 1980s, interest rates rose near 10% to fight inflation. If rates approach that level today, the interest bill could exceed total federal revenue. So the margin for aggressive tightening is smaller. The balancing act becomes delicate. And here's the psychological twist. Most people do not experience this as a crisis. There is no bank run, no dramatic default, no announcement that says, "We are devaluing your money." Instead, there is a slow normalization of higher prices, a subtle adjustment of expectations, a quiet acceptance that groceries cost more, that housing costs more, that insurance costs more, the boiling water effect. But every degree warmer reduces the real weight of $38 trillion, and every degree warmer reduces the real value of your savings. This is the great wealth transfer of the modern era. Not from one country to another, but from savers to debtors, from fixed income to asset holders, from the cautious to the leveraged. And if inflation alone is not enough, if markets resist, if capital tries to escape, there is one final layer of control being discussed quietly in policy circles, a tool that removes the last barrier between central banks and individual balances. Because physical cash, the ability to withdraw money and hold it outside the banking system, limits how negative rates can go. Remove that limit, and the rules change entirely. Because erasing $38 trillion is not just about inflation, it's about control over the velocity of money itself. And once that door opens, there may be no exit. There is one final constraint on the system. It's not Congress, it's not foreign governments, it's not even the bond market, it's cash. Physical cash allows you to step outside the digital financial grid. If interest rates fall too low or turn negative, you can withdraw your money and hold it yourself. Cash is friction. Cash is resistance. Cash is freedom of exit. And that freedom limits how aggressively monetary policy can be used to manage debt. Now, imagine a world without it. A world where every dollar is digital, where savings exist only as entries on a central ledger. This is where the conversation about Central Bank Digital Currencies, CBDCs, enters. A digital dollar would not simply be electronic cash as we know it today. It would be programmable. Interest could be applied directly to individual balances. Stimulus payments could come with expiration dates. Negative rates could be implemented instantly. Money could be nudged or forced to move. In such a system, the government would gain unprecedented control over the velocity of money, how quickly it circulates, which is critical in managing inflation and debt dynamics. If inflation needs to rise to reduce the real value of $38 trillion faster, policy could encourage spending. If inflation needs to cool temporarily, spending could be discouraged. This is not science fiction. Versions of digital currencies are already being explored globally. The stated goal is efficiency, financial inclusion, modernization. But from a debt management perspective, the implications are powerful. Because once money is fully digital, the last escape valve disappears. No mattress, no safe, no physical alternative. At that point, the ability to engineer real negative returns becomes far easier. History offers a warning. In 1933, during the Great Depression, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, prohibiting private ownership of most gold. Citizens were required to surrender their gold to the government in exchange for dollars. The goal was to break deflation and expand the money supply. It was legal, it was justified as necessary, and it fundamentally changed the monetary system. Most Americans complied because in moments of economic stress, stability feels more urgent than principle. Today, the context is different, but the lesson remains. When debt burdens grow too large, governments do not simply surrender, they adapt. They restructure the rules, they redefine stability, and they rely on gradualism. The United States is not going to announce we are defaulting on $38 trillion. There will be no dramatic confession. Instead, the debt will continue to rise, 40 trillion, 50 trillion, while the purchasing power of the dollar slowly declines. Nominally, every bond will be paid. In real terms, much less will be returned. This is the silent eraser. Not a crash, not a collapse, but a steady recalibration of value. And here is the final truth most people miss. Inflation is not merely a macroeconomic variable, it is a political solution. It is the least visible way to reconcile promises that cannot be funded through taxation alone. It shifts the burden without a vote. It spreads the cost across millions quietly instead of concentrating it loudly. But it also forces a new reality. The era of risk-free saving is ending. Cash that earns less than inflation guarantees loss. Long-term bonds that yield below real price growth erode wealth. The system increasingly rewards ownership of scarce assets, productive businesses, real estate, commodities, innovation, not because speculation is virtuous, but because currency dilution punishes passivity. This does not mean hyperinflation is inevitable. It does not mean collapse is imminent. The United States still has enormous economic strength, innovation capacity, and global influence, but arithmetic does not negotiate. When interest costs approach $1 trillion per year, when debt approaches $38 trillion, when demographics pressure entitlement spending, the path of least resistance becomes clear: controlled inflation. Financial repression, gradual devaluation. The question is no longer whether the debt will be paid. It will be. The question is, in what kind of dollars? If 5% inflation cuts purchasing power in half over roughly 14 years, then by the mid-2030s, half the real value of today's debt could be gone. But so could half the real value of unprotected savings. The government may erase trillions, but someone absorbs the cost. And the most dangerous part of this strategy isn't that it's dramatic, it's that it's quiet. Because by the time most people realize what's happening, the math will already have done its work.